morning, everybody. This is August Railey, who is presenting a project called Cartels and Democracy that he worked on with his advisor, Rodrigo Nunez. In the back, we'll have a chance to come up and congratulate August and present him with his honors stole and poured. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to August, and I'll be back up in 16 minutes when you're done, and I'll have time for questions. Thank you very much again.
Okay, this mic is short. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
All right, okay. So, I'm August. I will be presenting on Cartels and Democracy, and before I get started, I want to ask a question. How many of you have seen the Netflix series Narcos? Okay, if you haven't, that's okay. It's not entirely important to my presentation, but I want to tell a brief story about how I came to this topic. It was after we got sent home for COVID my freshman year, and instead of doing my homework that day, I was watching Narcos, and I had just gotten through Dr. Nunez's Survey of Latin America class, and my dad came in to watch the show with me, and I mentioned to him that I wanted to do a project on the political relationship with cartels. And he said, maybe you could do a thesis on it. And I didn't really know where to go from there, but 2 years later, I ended up writing my first iteration of this project with Dr. Lee, and I studied the political relationship between cartels and the state in Mexico. And this semester, Dr. Nunez helped me focus my interests. He kindly lent me books, recommended articles, and pulled me out of rabbit holes when I needed it. And here we are, and I want to share what I have learned through an analysis of U.S. intervention in Colombia and Mexico. I asked the question, how might U.S. intervention policies in Mexico and Colombia affect drug cartels, and how might those changes then affect democratic erosion? My scope, I looked at the 1960s and 1970s to contextualize the growth of cartels in Colombia and Mexico, and then I looked at the 2000s following the Plan Colombia in 2000 and the Medida Initiative in 2008, and how U.S. foreign intervention expanded certain contexts of violence in Latin America. For my research, I used reviews by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, National Defense Research Institution, academic journals, and the books that I borrowed from Dr. Nunez. Before we get into the cases of cartels in Mexico and Colombia, I want to make a claim about their function and their impact on the state. Cartels have a negative effect on democratic institutions. They challenge the balance of power through several means, and because of this, cartels have grown to pose a significant threat to national governments throughout the 20th and 21st century. Through killings, kidnappings, extortion of police, presidential candidates, politicians, judges, journalists, and civilians, cartels are capable of distorting the public's perception of safety and security, expanding corruptive forces through bribery and extortion, and disrupting the enforcement and challenging regional monopolies of violence with police and military intervention. It's important to understand how this came to be, so I want to make the point that cartels develop within and around their respective national contexts and histories, and those contexts are important to understand how we got to the modern situation. This slide presents and summarizes the individual development of cartels in Mexico and Colombia, and this is important because it shows how they rose to power in different contexts, and it will be important for how U.S. intervention affects them. Mexico's trafficking networks and structures originated in World War II with disrupted opium markets in the Middle East. The U.S. looked to Mexico to increase production of heroin and marijuana for sedatives, and the national government of Mexico at the time, led by the PRI, which led from 1929 to 2000, had a legitimate stake in narcotics production for international revenue. Cartel networks built the foundation on this model, though they weren't entirely developed by the state. The Mexican government was at best lenient on cartels and was sometimes at worst colluding with them. There's a different context of development in Colombia, which came with agricultural modernization and tropical commodities such as coffee, cotton, sugarcane, and fruit. Exploitation by the U.S. Fruit Company led to disputes over labor rights and land rights, which created a political environment of conflict between leftist insurgents in the states for many decades. And smugglers originally trafficked illegal commodities such as coffee, and those trafficking routes laid the foundation for systems that would be used to later smuggle cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and other things. Both cartels and guerrillas use narcotics networks to gain profit, since it is a highly lucrative business. Since drug dealing is so lucrative, it enables people to make a lot of money. I'm sure you've seen in the news, maybe something like cartels in Colombia, specifically Pablo Escobar, bought a bunch of capos in the 1970s and 80s, and now there's an environmental crisis. That means they have a lot of money. And that's important because this leads me to my first point. Cartels leverage economic power and violence against the states and societies within which they interact. And obviously, cartels do face opposition from the state in legitimate ways, the military and the police. And because of this brings me to my second point. U.S. foreign intervention expands violent strategies, increasing military participation in regional violence. But cartels are not the only perpetrators of violence and disruption. That's an important point because U.S. foreign intervention is crucial to their growth and their responsive actions. Obviously, the U.S. has a long history of intervention in Latin America, and it has a history of foreign intervention with the global disruption of cartels. For my research, I looked at the structure of cartels in Colombia and Mexico after two foreign intervention policies. I'll start with intervention in Colombia with the Plan Colombia. This increased safety and security expenditures in Colombia by 340%, accounting for $2.8 billion in aid, which was used to provide weapons, specialized training, transport, and surveillance equipment to the Colombian National Police. Before Plan Colombia, Colombia had a divided security force in which the National Police were responsible for counter-narcotics and the National Army was responsible for counterinsurgency. Cartels targeted politicians, judges, journalists, and police. They assassinated a presidential candidate. They led and organized, well, they didn't lead, but they organized the Palace of Justice siege in 1985, where they attacked the Supreme Court of Colombia, and they organized the Avianca Flight 203 attack, which blew up an airplane, killing everyone on board. During the 1990s, context improved a bit with the assassination of Pablo Escobar. This temporarily disrupted the hierarchy of cartels in Colombia, and FARC peace agreements, which was the peace agreements between the leftist insurgents and the Colombian state, briefly improved situations. However, after Plan Colombia, expanded funding to the Colombian army balanced the power of security between the army and the police. With the 2001 9/11 bombing, the U.S. was adamant on expanding intervention funding and pushed billions of dollars into initiatives that would combat counterinsurgency and cartel networks. This led to the proliferation of false positive cases. False positive cases arose because funding is contingent on success. So military began to attack non-combatants and civilians who were suspected to be involved with drug cartels and insurgencies. In total, 23,000 deaths were affiliated with anti-narcotics intervention initiatives, and of that, 1,700 were false positives, innocent people who lost their lives. And at worst, that's the case. People lose their lives. And even with all that, drug production and consumption didn't drop significantly in Colombia or the United States. Now I want to show you how much the cartels grew before and after the Plan Colombia. Production and distribution was equally intense. Now for the Mexican case. In Mexico, I looked at the Railey initiative. This expanded security expenditures by 125%, accounting for $1.3 billion in aid, and provided weapons, specialized training, surveillance, and transport. Since the PRI recognized the production and distribution of drug cartels and was lenient for such a long time, there wasn't as much open violence between the state and the cartels for a long time. But with the collapse of the PRI in 2000, the mayors, senators, and judges that at one point supported or colluded with the cartels were taken out from under them. They lost their political support. And during 2002, the arrest of Jose Cardenas, the Sinaloa cartel head, and the killing of Arturo de Sena Losetas fractured their hierarchy further. An eruption of territorial disputes, killings, and kidnappings rose, and cartels became a national security threat in Mexico. The map below tracks how political divides and cartel territorial divides influence. Where you see yellow lines, that's incidences where territorial disputes and turf wars occur, increasing violence. Both political and hierarchical fragmentation caused an increase of violence in Mexico, and territorial disputes eventually came to clash with the military, which increased the violence and severity of violent methods used. The corrupt sectors of states that fragmented didn't disappear. Politicians, the judges, the military officials, and police were still present in the political environment, but they were no longer able to do anything legitimately with cartels. So this brings me to my two findings. I want to return to something that I mentioned earlier. The development of Mexico and Colombia is unique. Cartels in Mexico and Colombia developed differently. Mexican cartels developed within the purview of the state, and Colombian cartels developed outside the state, leading to different experiences with fractured government actors, which later influenced criminal networks and political responses. The same actions, whether it was extradition, assassinations, or interdiction policies, eventually disrupted the political scene to the point, and expanding military participation didn't change that systemic corruption. It also enabled cartels to leverage a different form of violence against the state. Which brings me to my final. It's difficult to make a definitive claim on this because it's an ongoing process. There are many factors, and I've only scratched the surface of what has occurred. But U.S. intervention pushes cartels to adapt their coercive mechanisms. It makes them more violent. It puts military funding and weapons into the hands of people who are operating outside of the state, but it also puts it into the hands of people within the state who don't have clear goals of what they're trying to achieve. Corrupt fragments of the state aren't addressed with most policies, and U.S. intervention should consider the historic relationship between the state and cartels before increasing military support and fragmentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, August. Are there questions for August?
Can you go back to the slide with like the map?
In Mexico or Colombia?
That.
Yes.
So is this over time how the violence has increased in Mexico?
Yes, this is specifically something that I found while researching territorial disputes between cartels. There's a similar interaction with political systems. When the PRI fell out of power, opposing, I suppose, parties such as the PAN came into power, and those disputes sort of changed regional varieties of which members of the government were supporting cartels, which weren't. And the map that you see is how cartels fractured after territorial disputes arose, whether it was from political violence or the fragmentation when heads of the cartels and hierarchy were disrupted.
So if you have more time to research and study this topic, what else did you find that you would like to dive deeper into?
One of the things across but haven't been able to research fully is the extent to which violence and coercive mechanisms like bribery have changed the political structure of Colombia and Mexico, and how much that is leveraged. There are two processes, one called state reconfiguration and state co-optation. Those are very complicated, and I think it shows that there's pushback from the state, but there's also a system in place whereby cartels are able to affect the political systems. And I think it's an important topic because it's both a national security and a political issue.
Do you think the cartel situation would improve without any U.S. intervention, or do you think it would worse?
I think, it depends on the relationship between the state and cartels. Obviously, intervention decreases certain aspects of cartel interaction, whether it's production routes or trafficking systems. But what's important to mention is that if demand isn't met, like the demand issue where we're the biggest purchaser of marijuana, heroin, methamphetamine in the United States, we give billions of dollars to that system. If that's not addressed first, those production and trafficking networks are going to change to a different country. Mexico and Colombia are the two that I studied, but this occurs throughout the Caribbean, throughout Latin America, throughout America itself, and I think intervention is important, but it needs to be intentional.
And Dr. Munoz, can I invite you up at this point to say a few words if you'd like, and to present August with a stolen cord that he'll wear at graduation?
I wish I knew I was going to do this. I would have shade. I went nice clothes. I wasn't expecting this. However, I don't want to say much about his research. I think his research speaks for itself, and he can read the paper, obviously. I'm looking forward to reading it. But I'd like to say a couple things about you mentioned you were in my class your freshman year before COVID. That makes me think that I had you as a student before COVID, during COVID, and then after COVID, right? And despite all those major catastrophic, terrible changes that we experienced in these past few years, August is a very constant kind of person, I must admit. And one of the constant things that I got from him, which is something that to me is really the sign of somebody who is a great student and is destined for nice, good things in life, is this kind of very positive attitude about education, about learning. Not because he's the best academically gifted student, because he isn't. Right? I mean, you've heard of it. I know. But he is that kind of student who, no, he's a good student, obviously, but who you can tell that they struggle with questions. They have a level of uncertainty about their own work, which I think is healthy, and they are interested and they display interest, and they are really just motivated to learn and get better. And I think that as a professor, there's nothing else that I could ask from anybody in my classes. So very much thank you for that. I remember the first time I saw him in my class, I was like, who is this now? He likes to talk a lot.